Digital rights, the new frontier of human rights. Contact tracing, mobile payments, instant messaging. Technology during the pandemic has unleashed a wave of opportunities. But the tools we have come to rely on this year, like no other, also bring with them a darker side. Every day, fake news draws in millions of views despite the laws against creating and spreading it. Troll farms and bots pump out misinformation disguised as facts that often fuel social or religious divides, undermining the fabric of society. And while technology has become part of our everyday lives, it has also exposed a digital divide within our societies. This year, the coronavirus pandemic forced education online. Now millions of children are being excluded, as unequal access to internet means the poorest are left behind. Algorithms, which make automated decisions across a broad range of sectors, from housing to employment, have been called unfair, racist, or sexist. Research shows how some algorithms, for example, can wrongly identify black people as more likely to commit a crime, which can result in over-policing in some areas. And gender bias in programming has been proven to reinforce sexist stereotypes, like transgender travellers being subjected to extra searches at airport security, or women qualifying for less credit. Then there's the issue of privacy, which has become increasingly relevant to all of us, as countries roll out tech measures to limit the spread of the virus. Apps, facial recognition, and employee surveillance are all tools that have been utilised, but it's raised concerns about the long-term consequences. What if contact tracing measures were to become permanent or fall into the wrong hands? The biggest risk, perhaps, is to those who have little or no say in how their data is being used. That includes the majority of us. While making health records digital, for example, can help the fight against the virus, what does it mean for those who can't access or afford the platform? What happens when that data is sold without the right level of consent? And in an age where technology is at the heart of everything, what do people gain? And what power do they give away?
It is now time for our final live panel discussion, exploring the consequences of the surge in our reliance on technology for societies and for democracy. Please welcome Alice Munyua, Renée DiResta, Safiya Noble, and Urvashi Aneja. This session is in partnership with the World Economic Forum and is moderated by Antonio Zappulla.
To the final live panel discussion of the day here at Trust Conference, and good evening from London. We welcome the many friends in the West Coast of the United States, which I know are tuning in for this panel. And of course, we welcome those of you who have been with us from this morning watching, and I hope enjoying more than 10 hours of content. Now, if I ask you to think of the expression that best defines 2020, the sentence that each and every one of us has used at least once this year, well, chances are that the most likely answer to that question is the sentence, "You are on mute." And that is because our professional lives have become an endless series of Zoom teams or WebEx calls. Our personal interactions have been powered by Skype, FaceTime, and WhatsApp. Our access to news has increasingly taken place via mobile devices, because this is a unique moment in time that has clearly accelerated our dependence on technology when it comes to access to information, the way we consume, the way we buy things, and the way we communicate among ourselves. But what are the consequences of this surging reliance on technology for society and for our democracy? What are the risks to our privacy? And how does this increased reliance affect the decisions that we make and the decisions that others will make with the data they collect from us? And how can we make sure that as citizens, our relationship with these corporate giants is balanced, and that we can continue to benefit from these indispensable services, knowing that our basic rights, from privacy to personal safety, are indeed protected? So today we have a stellar panel of experts to help us address some of these questions. We got Renée DiResta from the Stanford Internet Observatory, Safiya from UCLA and the author of Algorithms of Oppression, Alice Munyua from Mozilla, and Urvashi Aneja from Tandem Research. Thank you all for joining us today. In particular, thank you to Urvashi, who's in the most challenging time zone for this panel. Please keep your questions going from the very beginning so there's more chances to actually get to them as part of this conversation. Use the hashtag TC2020 if you want to take this conversation on social media. And also, we're going to be unveiling a poll at the end of this panel discussion. The question I would like to ask you, and you can answer that in the poll function, which is next to the chat function on the platform where we are streaming, is simple, and it's the same. It's this one. Do you trust the companies behind the tech products that you use every day? Do you trust these companies or not? Answer the question in the poll, and we'll take a look at it towards the end of this session. Renée, I would like to start with you because you and your team at the Stanford Internet Observatory are really world experts on viral misinformation. And you argue that traditional media and social media narratives have now converged. And you recently used the example of QAnon, this amalgamation of all sorts of conspiracy theories, which started in 2017 and which has evolved into a powerful movement, which since August has been actively laying the grounds to legitimize the result of the US election in case of a Trump loss. What is the role that both traditional and social media have played here in amplifying this narrative? And also, what role have they played in trying to prevent misinformation and conspiracy theories from going viral?
It's a great question. Thanks for having me. So interestingly, our election was a little over a week and a half ago now, I think. And Q actually has not posted since the election. So this has been an interesting dynamic that researchers are observing. There's some theories about why that is, including as mundane as one of the people who was responsible for administering the Q site publicly left. And there's some questions about whether or not there are folks remaining can actually run the account. So the dynamics around Q are changing. But what we're seeing is we live in a time when narratives can come from the top down or from the bottom up. And so the major shift that the internet has kind of afforded us is everyone has the ability to create and disseminate content, and using the affordances of social platforms to amplify that content as well. And so the way in which sense making happens, the way in which people come to an understanding of the world is no longer simply all of us consuming media from the top down, where the story is vetted and created by media properties, oftentimes in conjunction with influencers or governments. So what we're seeing instead is that narratives bubbling up from the bottom. So communities of people who feel passionately about a thing coming up with a explanation for the world or an event in the world amongst themselves, and then prominent influencers pushing those narratives onto social media, and then actually media covering what's happening on social media. So one example of this, slightly off to the side of Q, was in the election, we saw some conspiracy theories about Sharpie markers, markers that you mark your ballot with. There were communities that felt that because they had been given Sharpie markers, their votes had not counted, and so they began to construct these stories about why that was, and that really developed within internet communities and eventually became a national news story, as opposed to kind of going the other way.
Renée, since the pandemic, the world has been exposed to a flurry of misinformation and disinformation. I would like to talk to you about yet another conspiracy theory, one that is called Plandemic. This is a 26-minute video. I don't know if the viewers are familiar with it. It's been filmed in the style of a documentary, which is particularly dangerous. And it features Dr. Judy Mokovitz, who's a former research scientist who blames the coronavirus outbreak on Big Pharma, on Bill Gates, on the World Health Organization. So she even claims that wearing masks is dangerous because it actually activates your own virus. Now, the video went online on May the 4th, and by May 11, it had been watched more than 8 million times on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter alone. Eventually, it got stopped. But how did it get stopped, and what happened in between and next?
So The pandemic video was interesting because Judy Mikovits was a well-known figure in anti-vaccine circles for about 10 years prior. So she was not an unknown quantity. She was just largely contained to a small echo chamber on the internet. What happened with Plandemic was the video was very slickly made. It was they worked with kind of new media organizers to distribute it. So there was a kind of a concerted effort from day one to allege that the social media platforms were going to censor this video. And so people who saw it had to do their part to combat censorship by downloading it and sharing it. So from the minute the video was constructed, it was designed to take this figure and push her, kind of package her up for the mainstream and put her out in a very, glossy, appealing kind of way, with this exhortation to share, to evade the censorship. So what wound up happening was that the video did in fact go viral, and we monitored its hop from community to community. So it broke out of the anti-vaccine echo chamber, and it actually made its way first to the QAnon communities on Facebook. And then from QAnon, it hopped into President Trump supporters. There's a kind of a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap there. Then it went from the kind of more mainstream Trump supporters to local message boards, just ordinary community message boards that anybody who lives in the community would see. And so that was what led to it being seen by people far outside of the echo chamber that the content was originally in. As that happened, the sort of exponential impact of all of these different types of communities sharing it led to the platforms deciding that they had to do something about it. But the problem was, rather than intervening in the kind of the initial upswing when it was obvious that it was gaining in velocity, they chose to wait and to take it down after the fact. So after 2 million people had seen it, then YouTube took it down and Facebook took it down, and Twitter began to restrict, I think, the sharing of the link. What happens in that case is that then the censorship narrative that it was originally framed with, in fact, comes true. And so it gets a second wave of attention as forbidden content. It was uploaded to BitChute and a number of different platforms that market themselves as we are a place that does not ever take content down. And so then there was a sort of secondary whack-a-mole game that the platforms had to play to try to tamp down on the content. But by this point, they had kind of created an effect where substantially more people were looking to watch this video because now they had heard about it in the context of tech platforms are censoring it. What is it that they don't want you to see? So what we want to see instead in those situations is responsiveness to indications that content is beginning to go viral or to gain that velocity, assessments of the content within the platform policy, and then the platform has an affordance for informing people, adding context in the form of a link, throttling the virality while fact checkers go and look at the content and decide what to do about it. So that's the sort of thing that would potentially have mitigated that sort of second order wave of the censorship narrative that actually attracted a lot more viewers to the video than it otherwise would have had.
And was this wave contained to English language, or has it actually gone beyond English language?
No, that's a great point. So what we started to see, and we have a big blog post kind of detailing this on io.stanford.edu, but what we started to see was the fact checkers in the US began to do their work, but the fact checks were written in English. The video itself was being translated and subtitled by activists in other countries, particularly QAnon communities that had gone internationally and anti-vaccine communities that already are international. And so as the US fact checks in English were beginning to come out, we started to see the video being shared in Spanish and Portuguese, Polish, Russian, and it began to hit all of these other communities simultaneously. So even as the US was, it was kind of on the downswing and the facts were now in place, the labels were there, the video had come down, all of a sudden you had the communities across the world who received this, again, kind of secondary set of versions of the video that had been translated for them. And what we saw was that it then took 3 to 4 days for all of the local fact checkers to write the fact checks in Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, etc.
Thank you, Renée. Questions for Renée, keep them coming. Question for the poll, open to all of you. Do you trust the companies behind the tech products that you use every day? Safiya, multiple studies, and I don't think we needed them to be frank, demonstrate a direct link between lockdowns and the record amount of time that people spent online this year. In your book, you look at data and algorithm discrimination. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what are the practical consequences of this new form of discrimination?
Well, it's a really great question because, I was thinking about all the ways in which during the lockdown, the sector that's really profiting the most right now is the tech sector. And so we are, in many ways, handing over more and more of our data and are engaged more and more in these platforms just by virtue of being at home and having so many of our everyday activities kind of redirected through the web. In the book, I try to talk about this kind of uneven way in which technologies are both deployed and how people come to be represented by their data or by simply the co-optation or purchasing of different kinds of narratives or identities, quite similar in some ways to the things that Renée was talking about, in that there's such an uneven way in which information moves through the internet. And one of the things that I found in my research working on the book Algorithms of Oppression was that in everyday kinds of technologies that we're so increasingly reliant upon, like search engines, for example, these are often thought of as neutral arbiters of facts, as people use them, in fact, like fact checkers. And for banal kinds of information, that might be perfectly fine. But for the most part, these are advertising platforms where those who have the most money and the most technical skill are really able to control different kinds of narratives. And so the result of that is that if you have to turn to search engines for everyday knowledge about people, culture, communities, this is where you start to go into some very dicey land where narratives about vulnerable people of color, women, LGBT communities are often grossly misinformed, skewed, borderline, just unacceptable, I guess is the only way I could say. And it's very difficult for people to push back on these kinds of systems that they're also simultaneously pushed toward through all different kinds of employment and education channels. Even in law enforcement and in criminal cases, we see that attorneys and judges will turn to Google search and use things that are found on the internet to help substantiate cases. This is one of the reasons why I often tell my students that the things that they put on the internet are written in ink. Think of them much more like a tattoo rather than just something you kind of pencil in and can erase easily later. So the realities about representation of people and ideas in some of these platforms has so much more weight than we could have ever imagined. And of course, that weight, I think, often gets deployed in very discriminatory ways. And that's the kind of thing that I try to document over time in my work.
You also say that we have now become the product that the platforms sell. What do you mean with that?
Well, this isn't really a new idea. I mean, I'm saying something that many people in our field of kind of internet studies talk about, which is that our engagement with all of these platforms is really is what's being monetized in the business model of many of the major tech companies. And so our engagement, the things we look at, the things we spend time with, the things we click through, of course, these are all the fundamental mechanisms for monetizing the attention economy. Dallas Smythe calls it the audience commodity, right? That we are turned into commodified bits that are bought and sold and traded. It's so interesting because we've come to understand, and I think the public has come to understand it a little bit more through the story of Cambridge Analytica. But indeed, the entire commercial internet is really about buying and selling and trading data about us for the most part. And so this is where I guess the set of concerns that we hold about being the commodity is incredibly important because, of course, some of us are considered more valuable than others. in that buying and selling and trading. And the data about us that's collected either opens up opportunities for it or it forecloses opportunities. And these are the kinds of things we need to be paying incredible attention to and probably indeed regulating.
I want to turn to Alice. Alice, you work in policy for a tech company in Africa, and you spend a lot of time looking at privacy and data protection issues. What Safiya just described is a scenario in which consumers are simply not in control. How is your approach and the approach of Mozilla and your products different?
Okay. Thank you very much, and great to be here. Now, for those who don't know, Mozilla started in 1998 when the future of the internet looked really bleak. If you recall, Microsoft was on a warpath to monopolize the internet. And, so what we did, we emerged as a clear opponent to this, lack of competition around that, the sector. With aiming to ensure balance, an open and free internet that's accessible to all. So we set principles in the form of a manifesto with a firm commitment to values like privacy, interoperability, free and open software, and a balance between commercial, public, and profit benefits. So our browser, Firefox, which turned 16 yesterday, has long held the distinction of being the most popular browser, not made by a huge corporation. So what we've done, we've spent the last several years literally fighting harder and louder than ever for the future of what we're calling a healthy internet. In codes to ensure that the internet is accessible and fair for as many users as possible. This is also because we acknowledge that over-reliance on technology will continue to hurt democracies and societies, I think, due to the speed, what Safiya has spoken about, the speed and scope of reality distortion, the decline in what we know as traditional journalism, and of course, the impact of the surveillance capitalism. So we also acknowledge that our socially distanced reality is super weird, and social networks make it even more weirder and dangerous while promising to bring the world closer. So these hunt for remedies or hunt for what we call a healthy internet, while it's at its very early stage, Mozilla joined the course a while ago by directing resources towards finding the best strategies for a healthy internet, for example, focusing on platform responsibility and evaluating what a healthy internet would look like. So some of the products we have, for example, we have a new open source initiative to document and explain what's happening to the health of the internet, which combines research on one end from multiple sources and continues to ask how much we understand and diagnose the healthy internet. And we believe this is a really timely and necessary conversation that shines a light on questions like, is it open? Is the internet open? Who is welcome? Who controls it? And who can succeed? And is it safe and secure? So especially around the safety and security, we know that people deserve to feel safe with the knowledge that their personal information is protected. So Mozilla helped found an alliance called Let's Encrypt, which delivers greater security to over 85% of web transactions. We are also trying to rewrite some of the internet's foundational technology, for example, by enabling a protocol called DNS over HTTPS, which would make it harder for carriers and ISPs to track users as they browse. And then we really strongly believe that data privacy is a right because it is essential to our safety and agency as individuals and citizens and not as passive consumers of products and services. So our private browsing feature called Enhanced Tracking Protection became a Firefox feature in late 2018, and so far has blocked over 1.6 trillion tracking requests. Then when it comes to misinformation, we know that traditional methods for recognizing disinformation no longer work. So, and also strategies for mitigating disinformation campaigns as they play out across multiple platforms and media are still not really well understood, especially at least not in the Africa region. So we believe we may need global policy for responding to disinformation and its creators, and also technical infrastructure that forces that provides detection when information campaigns are underway, being able to identify who's conducting it and why. So we are also working on changing, incentives for platforms to bring better content choices to us. And, leading by example, we've developed a product called Pocket, which focuses on content around contextual recommendations for content, not behavioral targeting, just focusing on people. And then on other platforms, like, for example, Twitter, we believe just because a topic is trending on Twitter doesn't make it true, and while election may be over, misinformation is still, trending and still threatens democracy. And so we are demanding, Twitter to turn off, some trending, topics. On Facebook, for example, which has become a breeding ground for extremist organizations and misinformation, not just in the US, but also, dangerously so, for example, in the Africa region. So we've developed what we call a Facebook container. It's an extension that helps prevent Facebook from following you around the rest of the web. So, the less data, they have on you, the less they can give away to bad actors. On YouTube as well, we're calling it closing the YouTube rabbit hole, so we have an extension that, or rather a regrets reporter browser extension that lets you flag regrettable recommendations on YouTube. And this extension is part of a crowdsourced data campaign to help learn more about what people regret watching and how it was recommended to them. We're also shining a light on political ads using Mozilla's add-on Observer. It's an add-on that aims at increasing transparency and holding advertisers accountable for misinformation by sharing, some of the political ads you see on public databases. And flagging those, especially because this tool allows you to contribute data about the ads that you're shown, which provides further understanding to researchers and to journalists and also the public around political advertising. So the Ad Observer is offered by Online Political Transparency, which is a product of the New York University together with Mozilla. So that's, there are many more, but this is the extent to which we have actually, put resources or focus resources in terms of, supporting what we call an open and healthy internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. We'll come back to you. The poll is still open. Do you trust the companies behind the tech products that you use every day? Urvashi, I'd like to talk about governance and accountability with you because big tech continues to grow globally, including in your country, in India, but you don't have data protection laws, for example, in India. So how can we align these trajectories of massive and rapid growth for tech with society and its needs? And who's responsible for that?
Thanks, Antonio. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here and to share the stage with Alice and Safiya and Renée, whose work I greatly admire. So thank you very much. It is very late in the evening, so I hope I don't start slurring or falling asleep, but hopefully that shouldn't happen. So just to pick up on a couple of points that were made by the panelists before me, we see as a result of the pandemic that the market power of big tech companies has increased, right? While economies and businesses all around the globe are struggling to recuperate, we see that big tech companies are hiring new people, they're making new acquisitions, and they have more cash reserves than any other companies, like Safiya mentioned, right? But I think something else is also at play, which is worth pointing out, that it's not just that their market power has increased, but their role as essential infrastructure providers has increased. And their role as providing civic functions in society has increased, right? So for an example, WhatsApp is a tool for the Indian government to share public health information around COVID, right? Or the Indian government runs many of its operations on Amazon's cloud services, right? Or we've seen the advertising revenue of media companies further decline as a result of the pandemic. And so the role of big tech companies as their civic function to command attention, to hold your attention has increased. And this poses, I think, this poses a problem for democracy in general, because you have a few tech companies providing essential functions in democracy. But I think the problem is even more complicated for countries in the global south. And that is because for countries like India, big tech companies are also filling essential gaps in state capacity. And they're also filling essential gaps in market capacity. They're also helping provide essential informational infrastructure. So many, many millions of people in the country were not part of the mainstream political dialogue, but have been allowed to participate in that dialogue because of the result of big tech companies, right? So on the one hand, they're providing a very important democratic function, right? But on the other hand, the systems of accountability, the systems of representation don't exist. I think a really good example of this is to think about the recent US election. So I think, there have been numerous articles written about how Facebook and Twitter, flag tweets by certain political leaders as dishonest or disingenuous, etc. And they were applauded for it, right? For in some sense, finally stepping up and doing something at least. Whether it's enough or not, we don't know, but they were applauded for at least doing something. At the same time that the US election was taking place, there was another really important election taking place in India, which was the election in the state of Bihar, a very populous state, a very contentious state. We didn't see the same kind of action by big tech companies in the Indian context, right? We didn't see them step up and label particular types of particular kinds of content as maybe disingenuous or inciting violence. We didn't see that, right? And that's the point here, that the Indian government has tried on numerous occasions to summon Mark Zuckerberg, but they have not been able to, right? India is one of the largest markets for Facebook, but they don't have data centers here. They don't even have a huge employment base here, right? So the point here is that when you have these big tech companies that are providing really essential infrastructure, providing really important civic functions in the absence of state capacity, right? So that makes this function even more important, and there's much more at stake. They're not just providing consumer products, they're not just providing enterprise solutions. They're in fact a critical part of the state building and nation building project, right? So on one hand, you have this huge amount of power, but on the other hand, you have no accountability and no frameworks to enable that accountability. Even something as simple as, if you look at recent examples in the past year or two of employees of Amazon and Google pointing out certain policies that they don't like, right, and staging walkouts or orchestrating online protests. These companies don't even have a large enough employee base in the country for that kind of downward accountability to exist, right? So I think that's the real issue here, that big tech companies pose a real conundrum for many countries in the global south. That conundrum has in some sense become accentuated by the pandemic, right? And I think what we see happening in many countries in the global south, similar to India, is that technology has the promise of, or is believed to enable us to leapfrog many existing socioeconomic challenges, right? And even if we accept that as true for a second, we may not agree with that, and I don't, but if we accept that, okay, some leapfrogging is possible, the leapfrogging that we don't see happening is around the checks and balances, is around the institutional capacities. So you're not leapfrogging that, you're just leapfrogging potential products and services, right? So you end up creating a very skewed balance of power, and the question then is that who's calling the shots, and how do you hold these companies responsible?
We'll come back to Urvashi. There's a question I wanted to ask you, but first I want to ask the audience to submit questions and to answer the poll next to the chat session. Urvashi, the question I wanted to come back to you is about these new dynamics. You mentioned briefly that there is a new dynamic here, especially highlighted during the pandemic, which is the gig economy. And we shopped online, we got all sorts of deliveries from an army of people on scooters, bikes, and cars. These people are on a tight schedule and they are monitored. How do you think this new model of consumption is transforming labor?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work on the gig economy, and one of the things that we started doing very early on in the pandemic was maintaining a tracker to see how companies, the tech tools that companies were introducing to monitor gig workers, and it was quite astounding. Many of these tools were already in play before the pandemic, but it was a harder sell, right? Because they were introduced for reasons of productivity or efficiency. But then when you introduce them during a pandemic, you have public health as the legitimate reason. So we see a number of these tools to track workers. And we see it particularly in the context of the gig economy. So for an example, your delivery agents, right? So typically they have an app, and that app, connects them to customers, etc. And the app only monitor their movement while they were at work, right? So you switch on the app when you have to go make a delivery. But now, because of the pandemic, you have that location tracking happens all the time, regardless of whether you're at work or not, right? So regardless of whether you need to make a delivery or not. And so we see this kind of monitoring of workers increase. At the same time, the idea of informed consent, it's a perfect example of how informed consent is failing people. These are low-wage workers. They don't have an option. The economy is crashing anyway. Jobs are being lost in the formal sector. So the idea that you would be able to consent to have or refuse to have your data collected is really a moot idea. They don't have an option. This is a question of livelihoods, right? So it just shows you also that how that idea of informed consent is so context specific and so dependent on capacity that it doesn't work as a blanket kind of rule. And I think just in relation to that, and I'll stop after this, is that one of the things we're also noticing is that we're seeing the platformization of other sectors as well, right? So your traditional IT companies are moving to a platform model. Numerous other, traditional sectors are moving to a platform model. And what and so that means that engagement, that employee-employer engagement is mediated through a tech platform. And then that increases or enhances the opportunities for that active monitoring of workers, right? And in a context like India, as you already mentioned, we don't have data protection law still in place, right? But at the same time, we see a huge surge in these monitoring activities. Labor rights are already very weak. One of the things that gig work does is that it fragments the labor force. So I don't know what is happening to you, right? I don't have a way of connecting with what is happening to other workers. So the ability and the spaces and the capacity to collectively bargain, to come together, for workers to come together is also decreasing. So these combination of factors, I think we see, the precarity of gig workers is becoming way worse as a result of these combination of factors.
Thank you. Renée, I'll come to you again, because you've been personally studying the way information spreads across the internet for over a decade. Going back to this idea of misinformation, the theme of disinformation, could we have predicted this flurry of absurd conspiracy theories and the way they managed to gain legitimacy really by infiltrating both the political discourse and the news agenda? Were the signs out there in any way? What have we missed? And what can policymakers do about it?
Yes, well, so the signs were out there. We started to see even, so the idea that the internet, that social media activism could transform governments became apparent during the Arab Spring protests, right? Then you began to see more authoritarian regimes recognizing that this was a profoundly powerful tool, and to take steps both to minimize its impact in their own countries, and as we saw, countries like Russia beginning to use it to wield influence subversively and surreptitiously in other countries. So there's the recognition that these platforms provided a profound ability to influence, to shape narratives, to activate people, and so that was a rethinking of the power structure related to that. What we started to see was determined domestic groups additionally using it to make themselves look far larger than they were. So anti-vaccine activists, for example, beginning to use it, and the sort of inadvertent amplification that the platforms provided them. So that was things like if you wanted to run an ad for a pro-vaccine initiative and you went to Facebook's ad tools, back in 2015, you could only find anti-vax targeting options. And that's because the targeting options were coming in part from self-declared fields that people had entered into their own profile. So anti-vaccine activists, that was their identity. That kind of, tagging, self-tagging trickled up into Facebook's ad tools inadvertently. But ordinarily, people who vaccinate their kids and nothing happens don't identify themselves as pro-vaccine activists. So even growing a counter movement using the same tools presented a significant challenge. So this continued to the exacerbation over time, recognizing that the recommendation engine in addition kind of came into play here, where people who were prone to belief in one conspiracy theory were actively recommended and suggested other conspiratorial communities to join. That was how QAnon really took shape. It was the recommendation of content related to first Pizzagate and then QAnon to entirely unrelated communities that shared a distrust in government. So recognizing if you distrusted what the government had to tell you about vaccines, perhaps you would also be receptive to this other form of government distrust that had taken the form of this, theory about President Trump fighting a vast cabal, et cetera, et cetera. And so that, again, that sort of push, the inadvertent recommendation engine dynamics was what was growing this kind of cross-pollination of QAnon, this creation of an omni-conspiracy pulling from all of these other disparate groups. But I would say even today, even looking at last week, folks on my team who were looking at election narratives, we put out a paper, a white paper, blog post kind of thing, a couple of days in advance of the election saying, these are the narratives that we expect to see. This is how we expect that they will spread. This is what we think we'll see on election day, immediately after election day, leading into the inauguration. And unfortunately, all of that came true. And that's because it wasn't, a remarkable prescience and capability. It was actually that so much of this is predictable. The problem is, even though now we're at a point where platforms, particularly for election 2020 in the US, recognize the threat, the means that they have at their disposal to kind of intercede are things like labeling, takedowns, and throttling. And now we're at a point where, while we can maybe minimize the reach or the spread on social platforms, the fact is these communities have come together, they've found each other. Getting kicked off of one platform means they migrate to another platform, and we're not really addressing some of the root causes that are causing these conspiratorial beliefs to continue to sort of to underpin our society. So we can predict it, but we can't necessarily prevent it. And that's because even the people who are writing the debunking content or preemptively saying these are the narratives that you're going to see, they don't enjoy positions of trust within these communities that are going to be the ones who are spreading the narrative. So it's not just a technology problem, it's also a society problem. And addressing the one without dealing with the root cause of the other means that all we're going to be doing is fighting a whack-a-mole battle where people who continue to hold these beliefs are prevented from expressing them in some fashion, but they continue to hold them. And that, I think, is the challenge that faces us today. We've sort of built this ecosystem. The horse kind of left the barn on addressing it solely through technology, and so here we are with this this residual challenge.
Thank you, Safiya. We often talk about the responsibilities of big tech towards society when it comes to election, and obviously Renée was talking about information. But there's another aspect here, which I know you're keen to discuss, which is often in the news, and that's taxation. And it's easy, I think, also to put the blame simply on tech companies, because some governments are proactively introducing tax benefits in order to attract their business. How can you solve that? What can we do?
Well, I think that Renée is right that, there's this kind of impulse to want to solve these problems technically, right? But that doesn't really help us address the root cause. What we're dealing with right now is, unprecedented global social, political, and economic inequality. Every year that we've been tracking and keeping records on global wealth inequality and income inequality, every year eclipses the year before and is worse. And so this, of course, primes people to also be available to explanations that are, might seem nonsensical, but on another level are aligned with their own vulnerabilities all over the world, including in the United States. So I think we have to address the way in which the tech sector actively exploits these vulnerabilities, right? By indeed allowing content that is conspiratorial to flourish, to profit off of the engagement. But at the same time, that these companies profit from kind of the worst viral forms of disinformation and harm, they also benefit greatly from not paying taxes into the local, state, and federal or national coffers for the most part. They, in fact, create the conditions of instability by their not paying taxes. I'll give you an example. I'm in Los Angeles right now. I'm right down the street from Silicon Beach. Silicon Valley is right up the road from me. And here in the state of California, we are seeing public education, public higher education, public health, public media completely crumbling, just so vulnerable to kind of financial, probably challenges we may not be able to recover from, quite frankly, given the pandemic. And here we are in the midst of California, one of the wealthiest states in the world. And Silicon Valley, for the most part, doesn't pay taxes, right? And so by it not paying taxes, it actually weakens all of the democratic institutional counterweights that we need so desperately in order to address some of the kinds of problems we've been talking about today. So I think these are very fundamental issues. And of course, it's a catch-22 that cities who are in crisis economically because of the lack of corporate tax revenues coming into their communities are then forced to their knees almost to attract companies to come and on the promise, of bringing more jobs. Now, they may indeed bring more white-collar jobs, a handful relative to the rest of the local economy. But then the people who are doing the essential work, whether those are hotel workers, service workers, are then incapable of paying rents, incapable of having housing. I mean, we see this all over California, that with kind of big tech, we've also seen, and other industries, quite frankly, we've seen kind of a corollary demise in the quality of life for vulnerable people. So I think we're going to have to address this fundamentally, that these methods of kind of offshoring profits, not reinvesting them back into publics, not paying taxes and working for every kind of tax loophole. I mean, it's just so disheartening when you see tech company executives, in fact, apply for citizenship to other countries so that they can, evade U.S. tax law. I mean, and then these are the very people who get put in charge of, tech policy reform. I mean, this is just completely maddening for those of us who care about these issues and want to see real systemic change. The same actors that have brought us the problems and who are deeply implicated both personally and in the corporate decisions that they've made are then indeed put to the front of the line and put in charge of the so-called reform that indeed I will remind us once again that it has been the women, it has been the people of color, the LGBTQ communities. We are the people who have been doing the work for more than 20 years, collecting the data, telling these stories, trying to raise the alarm. And yet, we are not the people in charge of making the better tax policy and other kinds of social and economic policy that stem from the harms that we've researched. So I think, we have to get serious about these issues because we're truly, I think, in a race to the bottom.
Thank you, Safiya. We got a lot of questions. Just before we get to the Q&A, I just wanted to go back to Alice. Because you said something really interesting earlier. You said at Mozilla, we consider the internet a global open resource. I wanted to ask you, how severe is then the risk that without the right frameworks for this global and open resource in countries, especially that have weak governance and little accountability, referring to what Urvashi was saying earlier, this global resource becomes a tool of surveillance?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question there. And to go back to what Urvashi was saying, regarding, first, really, it was not lost on us with the amount of policy changes and resources and efforts that platforms put in safeguarding the US elections, and are still invested in the elections around the world. The fact that some of these platforms play such a key role in safeguarding election is a problem in and of itself. And then I look at African countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and Tunisia that witnessed political actors mounting, digital information operations to influence the results of elections, it makes us really concerned, and not to mention the role that companies like Cambridge Analytica played in elections in Nigeria and Kenya several years back. But then there's also this concern around, those who are online or are divided by bandwidth disparities. For example, you're likely to see, police brutality of protests in Hong Kong being better documented and covered than the ones in Nigeria, Namibia, South Africa, and others. And so, the coronavirus pandemic has reminded us, daily that having a simple video conversation with somebody perhaps based in India or Nigeria is a frustrating experience that we don't really, take into account. And also, another point I want to raise is like when it comes to especially tech companies operating in the global south, a lot of them do is go on to exploit digital illiteracy. The fact that a lot of our citizens come in, use the internet for the first time, for example, they're using their mobile phones, and the disparities that exist. There's that lack of digital fluency, and so there's a level of apathy, that is produced around, ill-informed or dispassionate public civil society, which continues to weaken the democracy and fabric of our societies. So we truly, as Mozilla, believe that the biggest threat to democracy right now is that inability to distinguish between information on one end, misinformation, coupled with the lack of disregard and lack of responsibility by those who run these large tech companies. So another concern around, this over-reliance on technology from our perspective is that is probably not as discussed or covered as broadly in the global north is digital IDs. Digital ID systems, the use of technology for identity has become, really and increasingly the battleground for fighting for privacy, security, competition, and social inclusion, especially in what, as we see, more connected world, some form of identity is almost always mediating our intentions, interactions online and offline. For example, Apple ID, Facebook, Google logins, but now government IDs. And it's not lost to us that a lot of these digital ID or technologies that are being adapted for digital IDs are being pushed at the global south, especially in countries that have low rights, in many African countries. And these digital IDs are now increasingly required to vote, to get access to welfare benefits, to get access to loans, to pay taxes, to get transportation, and access to even medical care. And we recognize that part of this tech push towards digital ID comes from the international development community. For example, the World Bank, and a lot of them, what they seem to be doing is conflating the UN Sustainable Development Goal that looks at providing legal identity for all, and conflating the need for legal identity and using technology as a solution for that, for processing legal identity. And so one of the biggest concern is that when it comes to using these technologies for digital ID systems, it's usually the first time that marginalized communities are going to be engaging with technology, any technology for that matter. It's their first interaction. And so without this commonly recognized form of digital ID or official identification, a lot of individuals are at risk of exclusion, denial of service, but we keep continuing to do it. There are nearly 25 countries right now that have huge grants with the World Bank to implement some of this. And in those countries, no privacy and data protection laws exist at all. There's no digital literacy. There's no, openness in terms of how, who the vendors are and what their interests are, and so in designing and implementing some of this, what Mozilla has done is put out a white paper such that when governments and all the other organizations that are involved in using tech for ID systems, to take into consideration that while they are making those series of technical and policy choices, they need to take into consideration, like we built around 5 principles, the 5 principles around, for example, openness in terms of multiplicity of choices, in terms of decentralization, because a lot of these digital IDs are centralized, and they collect super sensitive biometric data. For example, in Kenya, there's a law that mandates the government to collect not just fingerprints, but also your DNA, your GPS, your earlobe, your iris, all of those super sensitive, biometric data. So openness as well as accountability and in inclusion and participation in terms of how some of these technologies are being implemented. Thank you.
Significant risk there. Let's go to the results of the poll. The question we asked was, do you trust companies behind the tech products that you use every day? Do you trust these companies? The answer is 95% no, which is perhaps not a surprise to many of us on this panel. Urvashi, with those results of that poll, 95% doesn't trust the companies behind the tech products that we use, and we are stuck with them. I mean, what's the alternative? You made a very interesting point earlier about the very infrastructure and the fabric of many of these products, and the Indian government approach to the pandemic, for example.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, I don't know if I'm happy or sad to hear that the results of the poll. I think good to know that, we're not just screaming amongst ourselves and everyone, that there is a growing kind of consensus around this. I mean, what you do is obviously really complicated, right? I mean, it'll be also interesting to run a poll on how much you trust your government and what the results of that are. And if we find that the trust within governments is also declined, then we're in a really tight spot, because neither do we trust the state and neither do we trust tech companies. So where does that leave us? So I think I don't have a simple answer, but I think that that's something to really be recognized, and what that trust in government, how that trust might have changed as a result of the pandemic with contact tracing or other kind of monitoring and surveillance tools, which also will not go away as the pandemic hopefully goes away. But I think the other really important thing here from a kind of global South perspective is that the distance between the designers of tech and the spaces in which they're deployed is way too much, right? I mean, everything Safiya said into 1,000 in the global South context, right? The people who are most affected or that are most harmed by some of these technologies are the marginalized groups within the global South, right? So really, really at the periphery. And there is no one speaking for them, not even civil society. I mean, a huge problem that we see right now is that not only is the new tech coming out of the global North, but also the critique is coming from the global North. Right? So the critique of algorithms, people like Safiya's book is not being written in India. Right? And that's the problem, because we don't have those case studies. We don't have those empirical case studies to go to a policymaker with and say, hey, this is what is happening as a result of a Google search engine. There's only so many times that using the compass example over and over again has any resonance, right, with an Indian policymaker. They'll be like, oh, that's an American problem. That's not our problem, right? So I think that big tech companies or tech companies in general that have such an inordinate influence of our democracies, we need to have more feet on the ground. They need to have much, much, much greater domestic presence. And at the same time, we have to invest in building that civil society capacity so that the empirical evidence about where things are going wrong and what is going wrong is not only coming from a select few geographies. Otherwise, the critique risks replicating the same power imbalances as the products and as the kind of tech solutionism that we see.
We got a couple of questions from the audience. Thank you, Urvashi. And I just would like to try to get to a few of them. We got literally 2.5 minutes left. A question from Steve Tarr that I would like to put to Renée. Assuming Facebook was built for and evolved to make money, do you think it's possible to rebuild or repurpose Facebook?
The question of how to rethink or rework the business model, I think, is a very important one. I think one of the challenges we have is that new platforms don't currently attract a lot of users. There's a kind of a lock-in. You're on a social network because your friends are on a social network, so it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling dynamic there. I think the work that's being done to think about how ads are targeted, to think about calls to, the platform has done some on a self-regulatory basis saying, okay, we're not going to accept ads from certain particular groups at certain times. But I think that we do need to be more carefully evaluating the impact of the business model and thinking about ways in which regulators can come in and address the lack of oversight that we've seen over the last couple decades at this point.
There's a question that came from Denise, and it's actually addressed to everyone. And it's a question that I really would like to explore. And it's a tricky one. It says, which social media platforms, if any, do the panelists actually use? Who wants to take that?
Well, it's no secret that I am a Twitter power user, and I might be on Twitter like it's my second job.
Same.
And so one of the challenges for us, is that we are scholars and scientists and organizers, and that's where our communities is on Twitter for the most part. So if we want to quickly and rapidly share information, like about this panel, we've been tweeting out about this panel while we're on this panel. So I think that's a place that we are. Like other communities, people gather where there are people like them. The thought, though, of a public interest type of space where scholars and activists and organizers and scientists and journalists could be that isn't exploiting us is incredible. And I think there's a whole, effort underway to cultivate more democratic public interest, nonprofit-oriented kinds of technologies, but those haven't quite taken off yet. I will say, though, we've been seeing people increasingly talking about more and more micro social media kinds of sites. And, we've seen, for example, in the United States, Ethel's Club, which is a new African-American kind of oriented social media network. Again, smaller spaces where people cannot be exploited and also made so vulnerable to trolling and other kinds of harm. So what I think we're going to start to see are more and more smaller social media kinds of sites where people can have more of a protected and a higher quality experience.
Thank you so much, Safiya. We come, unfortunately, to the end of this panel. I really enjoyed talking to you. I could have carried on for another 5 hours, but it's late in London, and I know you all have commitments. I want to say thank you to Renée, DiResta, Safiya Noble, Alice Munyua, and Urvashi. Aneja, thank you for being with us.